The Amazon basin stretches for over 7 million square kilometres. Even today, after centuries of deforestation and exploration, it contains by far the largest rainforest in the world. More than 5 million square kilometres of unending green, with vast swathes still unexplored and unknown by the outside world. At the dawn of the 20th century, following the Great Rubber Boom, when ruthless rubber barons and the caucheros employed by them had ranged far and wide through the forest to make their fortunes from the so-called black gold extracted from certain trees, far less was known. After centuries of vicious conflict, endemic slave-taking, and ruthless ethnic cleansing, the indigenous people were by then often particularly hostile to outsiders, only adding to the mystery of the place. This was the world in which English surveyor Percy Harrison Fawcett and his small team of explorers found themselves in 1910, on canoes while heading down an unknown section of the Heath River in Bolivia, on behalf of the South American Boundary Commission. Their mission, also supported by the Royal Geographic Society of London, to chart that nation's untracked and unmapped northern borders with Brazil. Just 7 days into the journey, the first sign of contact with the locals was observed. With a barrage of 6-foot-long poisonous arrows raining down from the canopy and into the side of the beached canoe. Nothing was ever easy in the land of trees. Four years earlier, in 1906, a similar incident had ended with Fawcett's pilot being riddled with 42 arrows while separated from the group. Despite Fawcett's frantic attempts to establish contact with the group, the rest of the men, quite understandably, paddled away as fast as they could, still being showered by arrows as they fled. Fawcett later recalled the appearance of those warriors on the riverbank, ranged against him, knowing that due to their brutal treatment down the long centuries, they'd been imbued with a certain deadly vengeance against the stranger. With great stretched earlobes and quills thrust from side to side through their nostrils, seeming to exaggerate facial features, their bodies were painted all over. Some would cover themselves in charcoal, striking silently in the dark, or hidden in the daytime. Others, painted in vibrant red pigments, announced themselves before an attack with yells, showing their faces to the enemy. With those ones, there was hope. Fawcett did something unusual then, still vividly remembered in later life by his erstwhile companion Henry Costin. Already having drilled in non-violent methods to his men, possibly being the only reason they weren't already dead, Fawcett reiterated this command, throwing his belt and machete down and striding forth in what would ultimately become his signature move, arms raised to signal peaceful intentions, as his men similarly broke out into a raucous rendition of a popular British song, accompanied by accordion, in attempts to defuse the situation. Warning arrows still firing all the while. over his many years of exploring the Amazonian wilderness, Fawcett had by then picked up various indigenous words, and now repeated what he thought meant friend, as he walked directly towards the locals. Soon enough, one stepped forward and led Fawcett into the forest. His men, left alone for the next hour on the riverbank to ponder his disappearance. But Percy Fawcett wasn't just any official of the Boundary Commission. He was the last of the great Victorian explorers. Commissioned by the Royal Geographic Society to present his findings on behalf of scientists everywhere. An expert hunter with an iron constitution. By this point, he'd already spent years roaming the wilds, contacting and talking to indigenous people, studying the forest and the manner of its occupants. Seeing far more in the bands of Indian warriors than was usual among his contemporaries. During his many expeditions, which often took years to complete, Percy Fawcett travelled further and wider in the Amazon than almost any other individual during his lifetime. Having contacted and befriended many native groups, during which time he'd gradually formed his unorthodox opinions. For Fawcett, the Indians of the forest were not just savages, but often intelligent and noble people, with a lost history of old. Seeing with his own eyes the vast stockpiles of food they often had, and crops they grew in the floodplains on either side of the mighty river and its many tributaries. Witnessing their ingenious methods of gathering food and fish, he'd began to suspect secrets long hidden. Even cities and civilizations long overlooked by the outside world. Finally, after an hour, Fawcett returned, accompanied by a native wearing his hat and a friendly invitation to the local village. The people here would help the explorers with everything they had. By the time Fawcett resigned from the Boundary Commission in 1911, he'd undertook half a dozen expeditions into the wilderness. Often months ahead of schedule, sometimes alone, completely redefining the borders of South America in the process. By the 1910s, however, he was intent on finding something completely different. A lost civilization he was convinced existed out in the forest. From then onwards, he embarked on a new career in the burgeoning field of anthropology. Few tales of exploration are as intoxicating as that of Percy Fawcett. He remains an alluring figure, not easily defined. A no-nonsense military officer, desperate to restore the fortunes of his fallen family following the privations of an alcoholic father. He'd led an artillery brigade in the First World War, well into his 50s, yet was often seen as especially unforgiving to his team members. even press-ganging his contemporaries into action when in the forest, driving them endlessly onwards through pain and hunger. He was also a romantic, writing eloquently to his long-suffering wife of his life's work and dream, his vision of a lost Amazonian civilization, just out of reach, out beyond the horizon. He called it Z. Already influenced by the theosophical and occult movements of late Victorian high society, as well as the overgrown ruins of Ceylon explored during his younger years as an officer of the British Empire, in what is now Sri Lanka. Throughout his 7 expeditions on behalf of the Royal Geographic Society between 1906 and 1924, Fawcett had been fixated by the abundant pottery shards and stone carvings he'd regularly come across in remote places, totally covered by thick forest. His convictions were only further bolstered by conversations with indigenous people. Oral histories speaking of ancient earthworks, white stone cities overgrown with vines, great roads and causeways leading deep into the heart of the forest, and the mighty ancestors who'd built it all. For Fawcett, the final clue to the puzzle, and perhaps best evidence of all, came with the discovery of an 18th century Portuguese manuscript, housed now in the National Library of Brazil. Known as Manuscript 512, the account records the discovery by a group of bandeirantes, part explorers, part fortune hunters, who discovered the ruins of an ancient city deep in the Brazilian province of Bahia in 1753. And yet, as far as most experts of the time were concerned, the nutrient-poor soil of the Amazon was not, and had never been, capable of large-scale agriculture. The climate, with its relentless heat and rain, was simply not suitable for urban habitation. With no signs of monumental stone architecture like that of the Maya or the Inca, most scholars outright dismissed the possibility of such a civilization. The great rainforests of Brazil, Peru and Bolivia being widely viewed as a land of scattered tribes, hunters and gatherers, just as they had been for thousands of years. And yet, undeterred by the ridicule his theories faced publicly, Fawcett's letters reveal a mind completely gripped by his obsession. As far as he was concerned, Z was real, perhaps even being related to the peoples of the Andes, or some other unknown culture lost to time. And so, by 1918, after completing his service in the trenches of France, being decorated for his bravery in the process, he would head back to the Amazon to search in earnest for his lost world of Z. Beginning to view it now not as a single city, but an entire culture spread out over vast swathes of the continent, comparable in scale to the other cradles of world civilization, like Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica. Having been wiped out by European diseases long before they could be recorded, and since lost to the insatiable appetite of the forest. In 1925, now world famous due to his swashbuckling exploits, Fawcett set out on his most personal expedition yet. Taking along his son Jack and his friend Raleigh Rimmel, heading out into the wilds of Mato Grosso, Brazil, near the upper reaches of the Xingu River, a tributary of the Amazon. They were never seen again. Fawcett's fate has captivated the world for 100 years. With stories ranging from his murder by hostile natives, death from disease or starvation, or even having found what he was looking for. Being installed there in Z as a king. Many looked for Percy Fawcett over the course of the 20th century, but no one could ever find him. And yet, in the century since his disappearance, Percy Fawcett's ideas have seen massive rehabilitation. Over the past 2 decades alone, Amazonian archaeology has undergone full-scale revolution. New tools including LiDAR laser mapping technology, revealing immense, sprawling networks of what can only be described as cities. Entire lost ancient civilizations amidst the trees. Not just in 1 or 2 locations, but all over the vast expanse of forest and sprawling network of waterways. Whereas the people power simply wasn't there before, and hostile interactions with locals meant few braved fieldwork, scholarship is now moving forward at an impressive pace, not just challenging all the old assumptions of the Amazon as an inhospitable green desert, but throwing many out entirely. Today, all the evidence suggests that Fawcett was right all along. As many as 25,000 earthworks alone having been found to date, as well as an astonishing array of complex city-building civilizations. It's now a century after the disappearance of that last great explorer of the Victorian Age. Amazonian scholarship has come along leaps and bounds, with new urban societies and centres located all the time. Fawcett was almost certainly right all along, and now I'm heading out on his tail. To find Fawcett and the lost city of Z. My name's Pete Kelly, and I bid you welcome to History Time. Let's go.
Oh man, it was such an honour to travel to the Amazon to research and shoot this episode. Just as it was travelling to the other incredible ancient cultures of the Americas over the last decade or so. But now, if you want to join me on more travels to far-flung lands, the very same trips where I'll research, write and film future History Time episodes, you can now do so. I'm headed to Turkey this September for an epic historical adventure delving into the origins of Old World civilization, and Peru next year to investigate the origins of the New World. All the information is in the video description below. There'll be more coming soon. I'd be delighted to see you there. Any questions about any of it, just send me an email and I'll get back to you. I can't wait. I can't wait. And now, back to the greatest rainforest on the planet.
The first Europeans to land permanently on the South American continent did so entirely not of their own accord. On March 22nd, 1500, a flotilla of 13 ships, manned by as many as 1,200 men, sailed past the colony of Cape Verde. They did not stop. With plentiful supplies on board and good prevailing conditions, they continued onwards, far to the west. A month later, they made landfall in a vast and abundant land, well outside the established maps of the day. There, they set about exploring the coasts of this new Eden, encountering a people who were curious and amiable. They christened it Terra de Veracruz, the land of the true cross. The leader of the fleet, however, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, had other ideas. Not comprehending how large the place really was, or the significance of this first Portuguese landfall on the South American continent, they loaded up with fresh water and set off back east, ultimately crossing the Atlantic once again, rounding the Cape of Africa and heading on to their intended destination, India. Where they picked up spices and completed the first successful foray of the Portuguese Empire to the east. Not all of the men had left with the flotilla, however. 2 of their number, chosen from 18 convicts kept on board for this very purpose, were suddenly given their freedom in all its horrifying glory. Instructed to learn as much as they could, in lieu of a potential return one day, the 2 men cried as their countrymen sailed away from the American continent. Nothing was ever heard of the men again, though it was later learned that on occasion the people of this region partook in cannibalism. Traditionally regarded as the discoverer and first claimant of what is now Brazil, little did Cabral know, but by the time of his arrival in 1500, a decade into the most heady era of exploration Europeans had ever known, a number of Spanish expeditions had already reached South America. Most notably a fleet commanded by Alonso de Ojeda, a former crewmate of Christopher Columbus, having arrived at the mouth of the Amazon and sailed up it for a while. Another expedition by Vicente Pinzon had already set a terrible precedent for interactions over the centuries to come. The commander of the Niña from Columbus's first voyage, he'd met the natives with violence. Sailing south from Hispaniola, where he'd had running battles and taken many slaves unwillingly back to Spain. Just like the convicts in the opposite direction. No doubt, they cried too. The next 40 years turned out to be some of the most momentous in all of human history. Finally realising they weren't in fact in the Indies, but a new continent entirely. Bands of conquistadors set out to claim new lands for Spain and for Portugal. In this new world. Most notably, Hernán Cortés taking out the powerful Aztec Empire in 1521. And then his second cousin, Francisco Pizarro, the Inca, in 1532. The two largest and most successful empires of the New World, gone in a matter of years. By the time Francisco's younger brother, Gonzalo, a hard and brutal man, set out into Amazonia from the Western Mountains in 1541, he was the latest in a long line of adventurer warlords to try and seek a name for himself and glory. Like his brother before him, and Cortes before that, he went in search of a fabled land of gold, said to exist somewhere out beyond the horizon. The kingdom of El Dorado. "5 years earlier, his countryman Gonzalo de Quesada had set out into the interior from the north side of the continent with 800 men, harbouring hopes of finding the fabled city of gold said to exist somewhere within. As other contemporary expeditions located and promptly conquered the various complex societies of the Muisca in what is now Colombia, Quesada eventually limped back out of the wilderness empty-handed, having lost over 620 of his men to hunger and hardship. No city of gold had been found there in the north. So now Pizarro would set out to find it in the jungles east of his new Andean domain. Accompanied by a smaller corps of around 200 of his countrymen, as many as 4,000 natives marched and limped in long trails back to the mountains. Press-ganged into service and driven onwards into the unfamiliar forest, the problems began quickly. Not used to the sweltering heat of the lowlands, nor the persistent abuse by their new colonial masters, many of the highland people began dying en masse. And yet, onwards they trekked, driving around 4,000 pigs before them as food, many hundreds of horses, and as many as 1,000 slathering war dogs, kept by Pizarro to neutralise any threat of insurrection by his subordinates. Week after week, they plodded on through dense vegetation and trees, sometimes going in circles, looping back round on themselves in infuriatingly slow progress. For the expedition porters, denied the large supply of pigs, or much at all in the way of supplies, starvation, disease, and the harsh conditions took a heavy toll. Finally, somewhere near the upper reaches of the Napo River, in what is now Peruvian Amazonia, they reached cinnamon trees. Pizarro desperately asked the natives of this place where more might be found. The mythical land of cinnamon which he sought, seeming just within reach. The soldier Chiesa de Leon recalls what happened next. Furious now by what he perceived as the withholding of information by the confused locals, Pizarro began mercilessly torturing his new captives, using the tried and tested methods developed by the Spaniards over the previous decades. Stretching some of the unfortunates out on racks, burning them with flames, and when information was not forthcoming, feeding them alive to his dogs. Neither men nor women were safe from the hideous treatment meted out. Pizarro now deeply depressed by the lack of progress and ever deteriorating condition of his forces, began to backtrack through the dense forest to try and meet up with a subordinate who he dearly hoped was still relatively close by. Having been separated due to the troubles of the expedition, with the express intention of trying to find supplies. That subordinate, however, at the head of a far smaller band of 57 men, suffering immense troubles of his own, had other ideas. His name was Francisco de Orellana, and he and his men were building something in the forest. Complete with a forge and a nail-making factory. They would not attempt to go back upstream, but were creating a European-style boat. They would take their chances in the other direction, on the river, to try and find food which they could then bring back to the rest of the force Orellana would maintain in later years. Or even to find the kingdom of El Dorado itself. Little did they know it, but the current was so strong that any hope of return would soon be impossible. Pizarro, who would never forgive Orellana, was on his own. Though the Spaniards quite rightly suspected the river to flow all the way down to the Atlantic, on the other side of South America, they had absolutely no idea just how far away this was. The things they saw on their journey over the next 9 months, from Amazonian tributaries all the way to the river mouth, completely baffles us still today. Meticulously recorded by the expedition's chaplain, Dominican friar Gaspar de Carvajal, and eventually turned into a detailed account that still survives today. This was to be one of the most extraordinary journeys in all of human history. Facing innumerable hardships and toil, travelling some 4,000 miles through entirely unknown and uncharted waters, Orellana and his men were the first known Europeans to navigate the entirety of the Amazon River and live to tell the tale. Assumed at the time to be wild exaggerations, Carvajal talks at length of the densely populated settlements and large communal houses lining both sides of the shore the expedition soon came into contact with. At the first of these, the men were so starved, having been reduced to eating the leather off their own shoes and belts due to having no food whatsoever, that they almost immediately set about eating everything they could find. Orellana was barely able to keep control of the situation by sending out scouts to secure the area, to make sure the locals had indeed fled at this invasion of strange bearded men, rather than lying in wait to spring a trap. Other settlements were considerably larger, home to many thousands of inhabitants, complete with well-organised defences and extensive cultivated fields laid out in relatively deforested areas. Some of these towns, like those of the Omagua, were controlled by complex states, ruled by powerful chiefs, many of whom continued to harass Orellana and his men at every turn as they floated down the river, injuring them continually and inflicting heavy damage as they went by. Launching perennial running battles in strong fleets of war canoes. The names of at least 13 such overlords are mentioned by Carvajal, as well as another 26 tribal groups, suggesting a complex interwoven web of politically organised states. Amazingly, in the land of the Omagua, and other groups further away like the Piratapuya, Carvajal describes particularly large settlements that can only be described as cities. And as we shall see, have largely been corroborated now by archaeology. Linked up by vast road networks, flanked by impressive walls and gateways, complete with monumental architecture. There was Pueblo Vicioso, the vicious town. The town of the street, named for its large central avenue lined with structures. The burned town, due to the Spaniards having ravaged it for food. And ominously, the province of the gibbets, where grisly severed heads would be displayed along the shore on racks. Immediately following the land of the Omagua was the realm of the Machiparo, a powerful warlike people who also bitterly fought the bizarre interlopers. Apparently ruled by an individual of the same name. Perhaps Machiparo was a title, like the Sapa Inca in Peru. Also representing the state itself. This was a highly populated land of many villages, with a main stronghold on high ground above the river. From here, Machiparo himself came out on his war canoes to make war against the invaders, time and time again, raining down arrows to such an extent that any kind of rest at all became near impossible. Not all the tribal confederations were friendly towards one another, of course. And in addition to the hostile indigenous groups like the Omagua and the Machiparo harrying them all away, Carvajal also describes somewhat friendlier groups, perhaps themselves having suffered attacks by these larger confederations. These people also lived in permanent urban centres, around which they grew crops like maize and manioc. It was only due to the help of such groups that the Spaniards survived. Meeting some of these people close up, Carvajal also observed expert fish farming, horticulture, pottery, cotton and textile making, and wide-spanning trade networks and information systems, spanning the whole river. An entire interconnected world, captured on paper just prior to its complete population collapse due to the spread of European diseases to which they had no protection whatsoever. In one of the most controversial of Carvajal's claims, the women of one of the groups further downriver, the Tapayas, allegedly fought alongside the men in battle, even living apart from the men. These women warriors, who came out to fight the Spanish, were skilled with bow and arrow, apparently inspiring Oriana to give the river a name that stuck, after the mythic female warriors of Greek legend, the Amazon. A substantial area was said to be subject to these women warriors, including a walled city with towers and elaborate carved figures, as well as ceremonial houses with feathered regalia. And on occasion, though it remains unclear the extent to which this could be a misunderstanding, prisoners of war would be taken to such temples for ritual sacrifice and cannibalism. Yet more towns lined both sides of the river for an astonishing length of time, until finally the expedition reached the lower reaches of the Amazon, where it splintered into multiple routes. Here, perhaps reflecting confused translations from go-betweens, an overlord named Aripuna was said to be in charge of a group of pale white Indians, whereas another, called Tinamoston, ruled over a group with black skin. In yet more claims, sometimes heard from neighbouring groups, others still lived in fortified hilltop settlements. Yet more had stone houses and doors. And finally, in the biggest traveller's tale of all, some were already Christian, Carvajal heard. Unfortunately, largely because of these over-exaggerations and travellers' tales passed on to the Spaniards, it made the whole account look fanciful. The tales were considered so fanciful in the years after, in fact, that Carvajal and Orellana were widely considered to be exaggerators at best, outright liars at worst. After 8 grueling months, the battered and broken ship finally reached the Atlantic in August 1542, linking up with Spanish elements along the coast there, returning to Spain soon after to present their tale of a vast, rich and populous land to the king, even securing a charter to settle this region that he named New Andalusia, returning in 1545 to the Amazon Delta at the head of a substantial force. Little evidence was found this time of the glittering metropolises of the previous journey, nor even the main river, and the expedition lurched from one disaster to the next. By November 1546, Orellana, now shipwrecked in the Amazon Delta and riddled with arrow wounds, died, we're told, from a mixture of illness and grief. Along with him went any Spanish hopes of laying claim to the vast Amazonian interior. For the most part, Europeans wouldn't return for centuries, by which time the forest had reclaimed the once prosperous, bustling societies therein. Pizarro, meanwhile, bitter to his last breath, had miserably failed in his expedition too. No El Dorado was ever found, and just a few years later, finally apprehended in his Andean stronghold following political disagreements with rivals, he was executed as a traitor to the crown. Even with 16th and 17th century ethno-historical accounts suggesting that Tupi language speakers dominated large tracts of the Brazilian coast, upper Amazon, and its main tributaries, suggesting interconnected peoples speaking a lingua franca trading tongue at the time of the European arrival. any concept of them being anything but savages was largely ignored. By the time later explorers again ventured into the Amazon in the centuries to come, such large societies as reported by Oriana were nowhere to be seen. Carvajal's story was widely ridiculed. Until well into the second half of the 20th century, and still now in some cases. As far as Westerners were concerned, the Amazon was a land without history, sometimes even without myth. But today, we can dig to tell the tale, clearly demonstrating this to be a gross miscalculation. Because just like Percy Fawcett's idea of Z, archaeology now suggests the historical tales of Carvajal and Oriana, those cities in the forest, to be real after all. The mouth of the Amazon is no ordinary river delta. Stretching for more than 200 miles from one side to the other. It's no wonder Francisco Orellana could not find his way back. Besides the many winding waterways, truly colossal islands are to be seen. It's no surprise either that Oriana and his men were able to break out into the Atlantic, past the many kingdoms they found here. Even today, still remote and accessible only by airplane or boat, this is a world in itself. One of the islands in particular, Marajo, largely covered in pasture for water buffalo today, a great expanse of flatland savanna and tidal marsh, is slightly larger than Switzerland, firmly sitting in the top largest islands in the entire world. It was here that by the 1800s, travellers began noticing large monumental mounds amidst the wilderness. Impressive polychrome pottery and other archaeology scattered all around. Investigated as early as the 1940s by American archaeologist Betty Meggers, and defined as the Marachuara culture. Marajo had clearly been a place of significance, though apparently one which had collapsed by around 1400 AD, even before the European arrival, due to its supposedly inhospitable environment. Meggers deciding the place to have been so harsh to civilization that a fleeting complex society could only have been achieved here by immigrants from the distant Andes. By the 1980s, another point of view would be entertained. Archaeologist Anna Roosevelt, a great-granddaughter of the famous US President Teddy Roosevelt, arrived to do her own re-evaluation. With no preconceived notions or theories to draw from in this new climate of archaeology, she carefully assessed only what she saw with her own eyes. Notably, Roosevelt found the mounds spoken of previously to really be tesos, elevated pieces of ground rising up over the swamp as flood protection, with clear evidence of houses on them. One site, known as Catamins, extended for around 10 kilometres down the Amazon, with as many as 30 such tesos existing here. One of the best preserved today is known as Teso dos Bicos. But Roosevelt found so much more. Here were earthworks of a monumental nature, raised causeways, sunken canals, ponds and fortified settlements, an elaborate remodelling of the entire landscape by human hands, and no evidence of connection whatsoever to the distant Andes. For Roosevelt, rather than immigrants from the West, the Marachuara had developed complex chiefdoms independently amidst the Amazon, fueled by intensive subsistence agriculture and culminating in major public works. By the time she released a full-length book on the subject in 1991, Anna Roosevelt had come to a number of conclusions. Based on their iconography, mortuary practices, and various other elements of their culture, she argued the Marachuara to be a matrilineal society, estimating a total population of around 100,000. Scholars have since gone even higher, with estimates of 500,000 today. With no links to Peru necessary, a complex hierarchical society then emerges here at the mouth of the Amazon, developing from as early as 400 BC, when horticulture becomes widespread and allows a surplus. Until as late as 1600 AD. Though, like Megas, Roosevelt also saw evidence of some kind of a decline by the time Orellana passed through, having begun 2 or 3 centuries earlier. By the time the Portuguese came to settle in the 1600s, both the Marachuara culture and even its successors were gone, disease having wiped out most of its inhabitants, leading to the post-apocalyptic world we see today. As far as most archaeologists are concerned then, the cultures Orellana passed through here and was so amazed by were already well past their prime. Much had changed in Amazonia since Anna's great-grandfather had embarked on his own expedition of discovery there back in 1913. Not too dissimilar to Percy Fawcett's in planning. In practice, it turned out to be a disaster which nearly cost the ex-president his life. The cycle of violence in many parts of the vast river system by then having become significantly worse by the increasing profits coming down from the rubber boom. Many of the modern metropolises of the jungle we see today, like Iquitos and Manaus, began as centres for this rubber trade. From where ruthless bands would head deep into the wilds, regularly massacring or enslaving indigenous groups they came across. No wonder then that the Amazonians retaliated, leading to their widespread reputation as brutal savages. for most of the 20th century even, let alone before, the deep past of Brazil and its surrounding nations was largely ignored. Particularly in the remote hinterlands, far removed from the traditional centres of power along the coast. Even after the 18th century gold rush and subsequent rubber boom, the Amazon remained a distant frontier. An endless expanse where history was flat, as unmoving as the land itself. And yet, as we've seen, none of this deterred early explorers from the outer world. One such figure, Swedish anthropologist Erland Nordenskjöld, who roamed widely across South America in the first few decades of the 20th century, wrote of old earthworks in the Mojos savanna in the Bolivian Amazon. Though little credence was given to his claims, not seeming to fit the established model at the time. By the time Betty Meggers arrived on the upper reaches of Ecuador's Napo River in 1956, undertaking fieldwork there on behalf of the Smithsonian, and coming up with the region's first ceramic sequence, her mind had already been made up. Despite accounts from the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, which spoke of densely settled lowland societies in the area, ultimately being overwhelmed by disease and slave raiding. Like most in her field at the time, the forests of Amazonia were no more anthropogenic than a forest shaped by other animals. Our environment ultimately shaping our world, and not the other way around. This environment was simply too harsh for advanced civilization to develop on its own, acting as a limit on cultural complexity. As far as she was concerned, life here had always been largely the same. Simple peoples living in small population groups that survived via foraging and shifting cultivation, leading to minimal environmental impact, like has been seen on the lower and middle regions of the Napo, where archaeology is severely lacking. In Meggers' view, and those of the vast majority of historians, archaeologists and geographers at the time, because of seemingly poor soil for agriculture, a lack of domesticated animals, subsequent protein deficiency and seemingly limited technology, the Amazon basin was simply incapable of supporting large, complex societies. And yet, Betty Meggers spent much of her career finding exactly what she argued against. In her 1957 book with her collaborator Clifford Evans, explaining the complex cultures she found throughout the Amazon as importations from the Andean highlands. Arguing for these very large settlements, suggesting reoccupation by small migrating groups, repeatedly visiting certain sites again and again over long spans of time. Meggers was so convinced of such diffusionist ideas that were popular at the time that she preferred to see Ecuador's early pottery-making Valdivia culture of the 3rd millennium BC as an importation from Jomon-era Japan, rather than a local development. For Meggers, the collapse of the Marajoara culture was inevitable. The descendants of colonists fighting a 1,000-year battle against the elements in the harsh land they'd chosen since they first came down from the Andes. Even as scholarship around her changed entirely, Betty Meggers clung on to her views until her death in 2012, aged 91. Already some 40 years earlier, by 1970, hints of change had begun to surface. In the midst of the great existential re-evaluations of that time, American archaeologist Donald Lathrap released a book in which he argued pre-Columbian indigenous populations to have been far larger than previously realised. With complex, homegrown societies and permanent villages, once having been the norm across vast swathes of the Amazon. Not shifting hunter-gatherers like is often seen today, but sedentary people reliant on carefully maintained gardens for sustenance. In consolidating the voices of a new breed of researcher that would eventually, years later, become the mainstream, Lathrap argued for the Amazon as not just an important centre for formative pottery and independently adopted agriculture, but in fact a source of innovation in South America. Innovation which it exported outwards rather than imported in from places like the Andes. When Anna Roosevelt set about her own research then on Maricho in the 1980s, in a new zeitgeist where anything could be considered possible, she found substantial evidence of Lathrap's idea of fertile anthropogenic or human-made soil. Developed by societies over generations, by incorporating organic matter like food waste and ash into the ground to make it fertile. This dark earth, or terra preta, found in large open areas devoid of domestic refuse, was likely used for intensive cultivation of crops like manioc. Unlike being at the whim of the wild forest we see today, like Meggers thought then, in vast areas of the Amazon, it is now becoming clear that people had shaped the environment around them for thousands of years. Not surprisingly then, when Roosevelt went upriver, along the main Amazon itself for her next big project, she found a similarly complex society at Santarém, where vast chiefdoms were described by Carvajal, and a vast city again thrives today. Other work has been carried out at the vast modern population centre of Manaus, some 600 kilometres upriver, revealing complex societies in archaeology as well as in the 16th century Spanish account. Whose talk of large settlements with vast numbers of people doesn't seem so wild anymore. Recent LiDAR studies have shown sites of the Santarém culture, which thrived from around 1000 to 1600 AD, to have stretched for over 100 hectares, leaving behind elaborate ceramics and significant material evidence, and rivaling other major pre-Columbian urban centres, and those in the rest of the world. This is very likely to have been one of those sites visited by Oriana. But far away from the main river too, in the similarly mighty tributaries, in themselves some of the largest rivers on Earth, great complex societies evolved too. The consensus now being of much larger populations than initially thought, intensive cultivation of the forest, and great regional variation. Scholars today tend to see far deeper timescales involved, and the very diverse nature of Amazonia, creating wildly diverse societies. Even in the once deemed inhospitable reaches of the Napo, where Betty Meggers briefly worked, amateur collecting by missionaries, oil workers, and sporadic archaeological forays have provided additional evidence of habitation. Elsewhere, the once popular idea of the green hell and the myth of emptiness have well and truly been dissolved. Hundreds of miles to the south of the main Amazon River, past swathes of dense woodland, in the shadow of the Peruvian Andes, a vast tropical savanna is to be found. 120,000 square kilometers of seasonally flooding grasslands, encompassing a mighty swathe of northern Bolivia. Today, this world in itself remains one of the most little-known regions of South America. Though usually considered an Andean mountain nation, the northern two-thirds of Bolivia is actually in Amazonia proper, an immense tapestry of green flatlands, strangely juxtaposed to the wildly high mountains of the south and the west. With sinuous waterways like the Beni and its many tributaries running throughout this outlying region of the Amazon basin. To the west, full-blown Amazonian jungle oozes. But to the east, covering an area almost the size of England, is a vast flooded plain, known today as Llanos de Mojos. In the 1950s, a Texan oilman visited this sweltering savanna in search of the black gold of the 20th century. Not rubber this time, but oil. And like many oilmen of the time, a geologist by training, when he choppered over this vast expanse during those years, he spotted many features sticking out from the floodplains that he simply couldn't explain. Features that appeared to be man-made. When Kenneth Lee decided to land and investigate further, he was amazed to see the tree-covered features were as much as 20 meters tall, covered by thousands of pieces of potsherds of an ancient culture. Apparently used to stabilize the structures as well as to expand them. Amazingly, Causeways strafed the landscape between the structures, thought now to be places of refuge above the annual flooding which covers this region. Many being significantly higher in the past than they are today. Lee would spend the rest of his life studying the ancient cultures of this mysterious and still little known land. One of which is known now as the Kasarabe culture. As early as the 1910s, the first excavations took place in this region. Though the sheer volume of such earthworks and mounds only became widely realised much later. In a significant feat of engineering prowess, 1,000 years and more in the past, the people of this land built these artificial hills to be safe and dry in the rainy season. As many as 20,000 now cover the area, generally being built for one extended family group, with skeletons too, to inter the dead. Some, however, are far larger. Isolated as it is in Bolivia's vast northern lowlands, far away from the tourist hotspots and the capital, the central town of the Beni region, Trinidad, receives few visitors today. Let alone the museum here, which still bears the name of its benefactor, Kenneth Lee. Yet, like many forgotten regional museums all over the Americas, this building is a treasure trove for those interested in the pre-Columbian world. On display, and in legion storage cabinets in the back, are thousands of artifacts from the complex cultures which once reigned in this region, long before the arrival of Europeans. Cultures that from the 1960s onwards have been studied by archaeologists such as William Denevan. Alongside all manner of intricately crafted ceramics, some decorated in geometric patterns of such complexity they've been hypothesized to represent maps. There are masks depicting realistic human faces, as well as all manner of musical instruments, suggesting a rich ritual life. And like many formative societies around the world, there are figurines. The almond-shaped eyes are reminiscent of Olmec sculptures, as well as those of other formative societies, such as in the Valley of Mexico. Perhaps these represented actual individuals in a form of psychedelic trance. Forgotten gods, or something else entirely. But here we have everything to suggest a flourishing worldview, and almost certainly use of many of these fascinating archaeological sites as ceremonial centres. There are also many pots that contained human bones and teeth, as well as all manner of wooden finds. Hopefully, more research will be done one day to reassess this large corpus of items. But outside of the museum, out on the prairie, is where this area really shines. From 2022 onwards, a revolutionary new technology being brought to bear. When Bolivian archaeologist Carla Betancourt began using LiDAR to map the Llanos de Mojos from the air, she had no idea what to expect. The results, alongside similar operations being carried out all over Amazonia, and indeed the wider world, were beyond everyone's wildest expectations. In the years since, vast amounts of data has been compiled. When the vegetation is removed from the land here, we can see what it would have looked like some 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. Pristine, this region was anything but. Near innumerable numbers of levees, irrigation ditches, causeways, reservoirs, dikes, aqueducts and loam mounds, stretching over tens of thousands of kilometres. With no domesticatable animals in the region, nor sources of stone, the people of this area, from around 600 AD onwards, set about completely moulding their environment by mass engineering projects on a colossal scale. Coming together here to overcome the nutrient-poor soil and wildly fluctuating water levels to thrive and tame the land. Hunting, farming and foraging for thousands of years, right up until the European arrival and subsequent population collapse. And this wasn't just domestic architecture. At sites like Landivar and Kotakar in particular, straight-lined causeways extend out into the wetlands to link up raised mounds. Some of which, such as several 22-metre-high pyramid mounds at Kotakar, can only be described as monumental. Just as a reference point, these structures are significantly larger than the pyramids at Tiwanaku in the Andes. Other U-shaped structures and rectangular platform mounds are also seen. Some complete with moats and ramparts, and seeming to be geometrically aligned with radial central points. It's likely all had ceremonial uses. They have been described as a kind of urban centre. In a far more intriguing picture than was originally thought, the Llanos de Mojos is one of the most exciting regions in Amazonia. In perhaps the final death knell to the views of old-school scholars like Betty Meggers, the latest estimates put the pre-Columbian population in this one region alone as high as 1 million people. But how did this relatively nutrient-poor region sustain such a large population? Well, the secret lies this time with another black gold. Not rubber, nor oil, but soil. The most fertile area, now known as Kasarabe, which gives its name to an archaeological culture which flourished here between 500 and 1400 AD, is the least waterlogged and most fertile area. During the 1st and 2nd millennia AD, and likely before, through the labour of generation after generation, an area twice the size of Ireland here was turned from poor quality clay and silt into nutrient-rich terra preta. Suitable for agriculture by systematically composting scraps of organic waste over millennia. As we have seen, this terra preta, or fertile human-enhanced soil, has become the source of much research over the last few decades, seeming to be the secret for much of the success and often dense populations of prehistoric Amazonia. And yet another sign of the great ingenuity of people here in developing and sustaining their own environment. Clearly, like many harsh environments around the world, from Mesopotamia to coastal Peru, people here were able to overcome their environmental limitations, to thrive, creating causeways and islands, growing raised bed agriculture of maize and cassava on the vast wet plains, and conducting rituals and festivals on raised temple mounds. And something else was seen here too. In addition to the large urban centres of the Kasarabe culture and its pyramidal mounds, causeways, canals and plazas, just like in the surrounding expanse of Brazil, large geoglyphs are to be seen. Already famous as one of the most striking features of the new era of Amazonian archaeology. The Brazilian state of Acre has always been a wild land. Once disputed between Bolivia, Peru and Brazil, in the 19th century it was home to its fair share of rubber barons. And today, following the devastation of its native population, loggers regularly hack down the forests. Cattle ranchers moving in to replace the fragile ecosystem with an even more precarious one. When the forests are cut down though, incredible finds are often made. Vast amounts of archaeological information has already been lost due to accidental or intentional destruction. But enough has made it to the wider world for this region to make it onto UNESCO's tentative list for a World Heritage Site. These are the geoglyphs of Acre. Beginning in the 1970s, these impressively hewn earthworks, known locally as taquinios, have been investigated and mapped. Not too dissimilar to other early farming cultures like the Hopewell in North America, and even Neolithic henge monuments in Europe. They have been sporadically investigated for over 50 years now. First investigated by Brazilian archaeologist Ondamar Dias, research only properly began in the 2000s, when the paradigm began to change to view ancient Amazonia as worthy of investigation. Just in the last decade, due to the use of new techniques like LiDAR, the river Acre, as well as the neighbouring states of Amazonas and Rondônia, have been shown to have well over 300 of these monuments, consisting of squares, circles, and ditches, wrought on a massive scale by pre-Columbian peoples from around the 1st century BC to 1500 AD. Walls and deep ditches have been found too, some hundreds of meters in diameter. Like the stone circles and henge monuments of Neolithic Europe and elsewhere around the world, the builders of the Acri geoglyphs seem to have opted to place their sites in especially visible locations, with excellent visibility. For example, crowning the tops of valleys and lining the edge of plateaus. Some scholars have argued for a concern with defence as a result, though, given what we know of other central places from elsewhere in the world, more likely is a desire to see and be seen. So far, considerably more than 300 geoglyphs have been identified and investigated in the state of Acri alone. Some a little like the Hopewell sites of Ohio, with multiple earthen structures. With more discovered every year, the pace of research continues. Though, unfortunately, it is now a race against time to save them before they are destroyed forever by the farmers whose land they are now on. Many before they are ever recorded, let alone dug. By no means all, but many of the farmers and ranchers of this region want nothing less than to halt their economic enterprises for what they consider to be unimportant mounds of dirt. The precise origins and functions of the structures remains unclear, with research really still in its infancy. But certainly they were created by large numbers of people. Usually thought to be ritual centres and gathering places, not too dissimilar to the Hopewell and the European Neolithic. Amazingly, a little like the Kasarabe culture, roadways have recently been noted, with straight causeways running between sites and communities, apparently for as much as 50 miles. Clearly, yet another organised society then, able to manipulate the landscape on a grand scale. The sort of grandiose engineering work Gaspar de Carvajal described his group being terrified by, and that Percy Fawcett dreamed of. All the evidence suggests Amazonia really was far from pristine when the Europeans arrived. Already then pulsing with a variety of impressively long-lived societies. Dare we say it? Civilizations. At the northern fringe of the Amazon basin, Venezuela has vast wilderness areas too. One region in particular, known as the Guianan Savannah, has been investigated since as early as the 1940s. Here, alongside riverine bluffs, upland plains, and savanna, terra preta is to be found too, as well as ancient settlements and societies. Likewise in the swamps of Brazil's Amapa coast, just to the north of the Amazon River, 11 impressive megalithic sites have been investigated, made up of large vertically placed rocks arranged into triangles, lines, and circles. These fascinating sites, like Rego Grande and Solsticio, recently dubbed Amazonian Stonehenge, date back 1,000 years and likely served ceremonial functions. On the other side of the continent, thousands of kilometres away, yet another ancient Amazonian culture was reported only in 2024. In Ecuador's Upano River Valley. Here, in the far northwest of the region, the oldest known complex society yet found in the Amazon is to be seen. And some of the most compelling evidence of urban life yet. In this part of the western Amazon, known for its significantly high levels of biodiversity and seemingly pristine rainforest, high concentrations of terra preta has been revealed, indicating not in fact a fully natural environment, but the intentional creation and adaptation of fertile soil from as early as 4,000 years ago. Astride the banks of the mighty Upano River, where that great tributary meets the Andes, French archaeologist Stéphane Rostand first explored the area in the 1970s, noting the existence of many man-made structures beneath the canopy. Some seeming to extend for many miles through what is now a great expanse of wilderness. In the 1990s, small-scale archaeology finally began, with entire settlements being described. Such was the extent of this enigmatic culture, however, that it would take a leap forward in technology to finally reveal itself in its full glory. When LiDAR was finally funded by the Ecuadorian government in 2015, a nearly 10-year-long study would ensue, revealing an astonishing level of development and a form of urbanism. Here, on heavily forested slopes and hillsides, where already fertile volcanic soils didn't always need to be turned to terra preta, the region was home to what Rostand and his team call genuine urban settlements. Like the so-called garden cities of the Maya to the north, these were relatively densely populated and laid out in grid patterns, with complex networks of streets and pathways leading to water sources, and secondary and primary networks of roads. Everything seems to have been connected, suggesting the clusters of settlements must have existed at the same time. A kind of society which required real urban planning. A dizzying array of settlements has been located thus far, with 5 especially large urban centres, and 10 smaller ones spread out across an area of 300 square kilometres. No doubt with a vast number of smaller villages between, interspersed within a wide area of agricultural fields, organised into rectangles. On the high ground all around the river, where tree-lined slopes are seen now, man-made terraces were engineered. Here, in a situation not too dissimilar to the Inca or the Chachapoyas in between, all manner of crops, such as corn and potatoes, would be grown, of a different variety to those traditional Amazonian staples cultivated down on the lowland areas, like manioc, sweet potato, and much more. And just like in Acre and the Llanos de Mojos, wide straight roads stretch out between the urban centres into the wider landscape. And not too dissimilar to Maya sack bays or white roads. Within the urban centres themselves, streets ran between houses, seeming to divide neighbourhoods up into sectors. The major population centres all seem to be densely packed too, with not just residential blocks, but ceremonial structures. Impressive mounds carefully laid out around carefully planned plazas. Much like those of the Llanos de Mojos, when these mounds are excavated, they show significant deposition of pottery in the form of high-status decorated ware with incised lines, as well as the remains of large jugs used for the consumption of chicha, an intoxicating beverage favoured by indigenous societies all across the Andes. Now, here, finally, alongside the potatoes commonly found, was Betty Mega's Andean link, clearly showing contact with the region that would spawn the Inca in centuries to come. And yet, even here in the foothills of the mountains, this is a hybrid society. Like the Chachapoyas further to the south in Peru, the people of the Apano Valley had their own thing going on. Forced to make a decision of where to focus their efforts, Rostan's team understandably chose the largest two sites to investigate, named Sangay and Quilimope. And what sites these are! In its prime, some 1500 years ago, the central hub of Quilimope alone covered a similar amount of space to the central avenue of Teotihuacan, the greatest city the New World had ever seen at the time, as well as the Giza Plateau. The pyramids themselves aren't the same size as those two other sites, each having good candidates for largest pyramids in the world, but in sheer scale of construction, it certainly is in the same ballpark. More than 6,000 earthen platforms, for example, all integrated amidst public squares. As far as the excavators are concerned, this was likely home to tens of thousands, perhaps even as many as 100,000. Not just Quilimope, but also the other foremost urban centres of the Apano Valley, like Sangay, Copueno, and Conquist, all show immensely long spans of occupation, with radiocarbon dates coming back as early as 500 BC, before they were apparently abandoned between around 300 and 600 AD. But succeeded by cultures to follow, like the Wapola. This isn't just likely the largest society yet found in the Amazon. It is also the oldest, predating the Llanos de Mojos in Bolivia, for example, by as much as 1,000 years. Rather than a singular Amazonia, because of the sheer quantity and differences between the various cultures therein, Stefan Rostan now argues we should say Amazonias. These valley sites seem to be denser and more interconnected than the sites in Llanos de Mojos too, says Rostan, highlighting the interesting differences between these two societies. One having more space to stretch out in Bolivia, but the Apano adapting expertly to their hilly environment. Certainly, in sheer scale of landscape modification, with innumerable mounds, terraces and roads. They rival anything else yet found in Amazonia, and even the garden cities of the classic Maya, according to the co-author of the study, Fernando Mejia at the Catholic University of Ecuador. Without a doubt, if the Maya world and that of Cahokia in what is now the United States are considered urbanism, albeit in a more spread out form than Old World urban centres, then this is too. We can only speculate on what links may have once existed between these Apano Valley sites and the Llanos de Mojos in Bolivia and other areas. But according to Mejia, what has been found so far is just the tip of the iceberg of what could be found in the Ecuadorian Amazon, in places yet to be explored, let alone dug. This is a mystery for future generations. The Apano Valley sites are still close enough to the Andes for Betty Mega's idea of Andean origins to still be considered. In order to put this theory to bed forever, there is another area, far across the continent, where great revelations have been made in recent years. Not far from Percy Fawcett's last known location. This is the best candidate of all for his lost city of Z. For anthropologists and ethnographers before them in Amazonia, there is a long tradition of not just periodically working at indigenous sites, but going all in. Settling in them permanently during intensely long periods of study over many years, or even decades. Michael Heckenberger of the University of Florida is one such individual. Arriving in the upper Xingu River Valley in the 1980s to live amongst the Xinguano. A diverse group of tribes still living a traditional way of life in Brazil's Mato Grosso rainforest. He remained there, on and off, for over 30 years. Unlike many of his forebears, however, as much as he was interested in the present ways of life of these people, estimating a cumulative period of 3 years spent living in the house of the Quiquero chief Afukaka, he was interested in their past too. Today, the Xinguano, who are largely considered peaceful, live in settled circular villages, engaging in an inter-village exchange network involving ceremonies at certain times of the year. Heckenberger began to suspect that the radial way in which they organised their settlements from a central circular point could be a smaller scale version of something much larger that existed before the European arrival. And soon enough, not far from where Percy Fawcett disappeared in 1925, he would find evidence of this. Situated in a vast wilderness region in what is now eastern Brazil, the Xingu River remains one of the largest contiguous tracts of rainforest in the entire southern Amazon. Surrounded now by a great arc of deforestation since Fawcett's day, with cattle ranches sprawling around. Due to the Herculean efforts of conservationists, the Xingu itself is protected to an extent, remaining wildly remote, with many indigenous peoples here still living a largely pre-modern way of life. By the time the first ethnographers began to investigate Amazonia in the later 19th and early 20th centuries, many areas had reached their absolute lowest points in terms of population collapse, devastated by diseases brought in by Europeans over the centuries. An initial wave of disease in the 1500s and 1600s, running through societies like a wildfire that could not be contained, then followed by flare-ups again and again over the decades. The reality is that most nomadic groups of indigenous people in those years lived very different lives to the average Amazonian for the entire rest of human prehistory. Generally living settled, complex lives before. The Xinguano are unique. Many groups here having managed to preserve their traditional practices and semi-intensive land use from prehistory all the way through to today. In the 1990s, not far from one of the Xinguano villages, Heckenberger was shown something he would dedicate his life to studying. This is Kuhikugu, a vast ancient settlement built on an epic scale. Complete with earthworks, roads, walled towns and villages, all fed in its prime by complex resource management and a diverse range of crops and animals like manioc and corn. Still a unique section of forest today, the people of the region have intensively managed their environments for as long as anyone can remember, turning the forest here into a garden. Percy Fawcett had been right. Though faced with a site such as Kuhikugu, with its surrounding complex of settlements, estimated to have once been home to as many as 50 or 100,000 people, he probably would not have recognised it. Searching for stone cities as he was, like the Maya or the Inca. People here had space to use. Rather than living intensely close to each other, they were spread out. And rather than building upwards, their earthen monuments stretched out horizontally. Due to their relative isolation, and thus not having been completely destroyed by the privations of the outer world over the last 5 centuries, there is a good argument that the Xinguano can be counted as direct descendants of the ancient people in the region. An especially rare place where the system of traditional knowledge remains somewhat intact. It is thus one of the very few places where contemporary observations about indigenous land use, agriculture, and settlement patterns can be linked with an unbroken continuum from as early as 1000 BC, all the way to the present. Between 500 and 1600 AD, including large, powerful urbanized polities like Kuhikugu, with core settlements arranged around large central plazas for ritual, economic, and political use. Surrounded by a highly planned and integrated regional population, linked up to clusters of many more outlying villages and towns, with even more regions around them, or more mobile and less urbanized people. Heckenberger soon began constructing a model of garden cities for the Xinguano, for they had clearly been a type of urban society. Much more urban than, say, the Hopewell of North America, or large parts of Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe. But of a new kind, only really recognised recently, sometimes known as galactic urbanism due to its clusters of settlements. Here, we seem to have an intermediate level of political and spatial organisation between solitary villages, with an overarching regionally organised, peer-based society. Much smaller versions of the massive central sites, all walled and all organised in the same way, radiate out from their central plazas. Just like they still do today. Albeit on a smaller scale. The plaza undoubtedly being the central focal point of the society, the key to linking it all together. The first step to a Chaco, or a Göbekli Tepe perhaps. These centres, the axis mundi of their world, were simultaneously a place for the living and the dead, and a place to orient the very cosmos itself, where all roads lead. By Heckenberger's day, the idea of domesticating an entire landscape had already begun to be discussed in archaeological circles. Not necessarily involving changes in individual species, but on a much larger scale. Change in the environment itself, within broad built-up landscapes entirely moulded over the millennia by human hands. A significant co-evolutionary change for plants and animals. Anthropogenic landscapes that, until drastically broken by population devastation, would have supported much larger populations than they do now. By the 2020s, it was the turn of the Xinguano for LiDAR to be utilised. Published only recently in 2024 and 2025, the results have been astonishing. Showing a landscape even more moulded by human hands than Heckenberger could have assumed. A landscape so wildly different to today, it is scarcely recognisable. Not just settlements, but earthen dams, artificial ponds, landscape mosaics with areas of acute human influence, along roads in settlements and areas of deforested agricultural countryside. with still forested areas of garden trees in between. Sometimes in archaeology, strange and uncanny comparisons can be made between wildly disparate and seemingly unconnected areas. One of these bizarre coincidences is one repeatedly emphasised by Heckenberger. Even before the LiDAR studies, but particularly afterwards, the urban centres of the Xingu, like Kuhikugu, bear a striking resemblance to a utopian concept conceived by philosopher Ebenezer Howard at the dawn of the 20th century, as representing nothing less than the ideal way to live, and a means by which to mediate Industrial Revolution-era pollution. An idea which was realised in the UK, with the construction of places like Welwyn Garden City. Here in the Xingu, we have a very similar concept. A vast landscape of towns, villages and hamlets, linked by well-organised roadways, always interspersed by lush gardens, copses and farms. A kind of landscape very different from most other areas of the world, which tend to concentrate people en masse when urbanism is practiced. The LiDAR showed that Kuhikugu was far from alone. Not just one urban centre, but a whole collection stretching over a wide landscape of 250 square kilometres. Kuhikugu does seem to be the largest residential centre and probably was a major political centre. But there were many others, like Nokugu, Halugihuti and Sehu. Notably, the northern Ipatsi cluster has 2 major residential centres. As far as Heckenberger is concerned, this was a whole network of permanent plaza communities, very likely making up competing polities. To enter Kuhikugu in those days would be to see an incredible sight. Colossal wooden palisade walls with gates and dug-out moats, likely acting both as defence and as a means to impress those coming in from afar. But also, perhaps singling out this centre as an important spiritual place for the wider world. Within the compound, extensive residential occupations split into bustling neighbourhoods are seen, including the remains of houses and refuse middens, and in the middle, a vast ceremonial plaza. If we're lucky enough to visit at a festival time, we might see all manner of celebrations, displays, even sombre processions. To climb up onto the walls and look out into the wider landscape, major roadways can be spied, as much as 20 or even 50 feet wide. And extending up to 5 kilometres between settlements. The smoke rising from a number of these satellites clearly visible toward the skyline. Raised causeways along with bridges and dug-out canals for canoes crisscross the well-maintained flatlands. made up largely of vast fields of crops and gardens. A lush expanse of raised beds and manicured fields. Orchards of specific trees and gardens. Absolutely everything having been moulded and guided by the hands of humanity. In all, Kuhikugu had 4 large walled, cardinally oriented satellite plaza settlements. All, no doubt, famous in their day. Perhaps as tribes and kin groups who came together consciously here for a reason. As has been seen so many times in histories elsewhere, not lost to time. With Kuhikugu, just one of many radially arranged walled settlement patterns. It's likely each of the central and subsidiary centres represented individual identities and polities. Perhaps with hierarchical systems of their own. Dynasties even. With yet more non-walled settlements beyond in the hinterland. Clearly the stewards of an anthropogenic landscape, the population of Kuhikugu alone has been estimated at 5,000. The whole archaeological complex of which it is a part, 50,000. And far from just large central places surrounded by smaller farmland and gardens, the subsidiary centres, still large, with their own secondary though still impressive plazas, no doubt acted as major integrating factors for the people of the area. The glue that held them together being the events carried out in these plazas. Great elaborate rituals perhaps, throughout the festival agricultural year. Like most formative societies, perhaps people came in from afar as a result, attracted by the pull of the ceremonial centre and the opportunities of the urban sprawl. Viewing the land from above, regularly spaced towns and roads form into grid-like patterns. Arrangements which could only be the result of extensive planning, based on common ideas or standardised geometric principles, which became fixed and calibrated to ecological features to incorporate them and utilise them. This was a landscape expertly designed and crafted over generations to incorporate the vital lifeblood of the natural world into the human one. All things considered, life in the Xingu 1,000 years ago doesn't seem to have been all that bad. Very much resembling Ebenezer Howard's Utopian settlements from the early 20th century. Like those idealised cities, built specifically to escape endemic Victorian-era smog, the Xingu sites were surrounded not by dirty industrial wasteland, nor the disease-filled suburbs of a Mesopotamian or oasis-style Egyptian, Indus, or even Andean city. Dens for all manner of diseases and filth. Here, green stretched in all directions. Not to mention the pleasure of just being surrounded by gardens all day, huge amounts of food, and perhaps even pharmaceutical medicines were on offer. After all, the rainforest is where we get the vast majority of our medicines today. When compared to the coastal desert urban centres and those in the Andes, let alone those in the Old World, life here may have been relatively healthy. Over the last few decades, the concept of pre-modern urbanism has expanded to encompass a wider orbit than ever before. In particular, with the realization that Maya cities and other forested urban centres, like in Southeast Asia, were far more spread out than the densely packed tells of, say, ancient Mesopotamia. Though still considered urban centres, unlike, say, Celtic Europe prior to incursions from the Mediterranean in the first millennium BC, or the eastern woodlands of the United States before Cahokia, the Xingu sites very much fall into this new extended category. Evenly distributed over a fairly large area, rather than intensively concentrated, with fairly similar house sizes all around. The model here may have been more egalitarian than is usual, perhaps, like with the acre geoglyph builders and the Bolivia sites, a shared ideology and religion being the unifying force that bound societies together, rather than a powerful leader. And yet, there may well have been some sort of central authority at the heart of a hierarchical structure here, be it a religious authority or kingly. Or both at the same time. Settlement patterns may well be hierarchical, with large centres of 150 hectares surrounded by plaza towns of around 20 to 30. And then villages of 10 at the very outer edge. Most of the plazas themselves were between 120 and 150 metres in diameter, acting as the social focus and probably cemetery too. The most important central centres, however, had plazas that may have been even bigger, suggesting a level of supremacy over other areas, which perhaps weren't allowed to have as big of a plaza, or simply couldn't sustain such a large one. Central places of 5,000 people or more, intrinsically linked, inseparable even from the lands around them. Put simply, there isn't really a place where the city stops and the hinterlands begin. It just keeps going. Multi-centric networks with smaller towns and outlying villages incorporated within. Perhaps operating autonomously under their own leaders, but linked together as one, maybe by religion or kin groups. Not a million miles away from Mesoamerican, Mesopotamian, or even Italian city-states. And now, we have to turn to the walls. Given what we know of other formative societies from archaeology, as well as the historical societies recorded when the Spaniards and the Portuguese came through, warfare and competition very likely existed between groups. Like the Maya, Moche, Mississippian mound builders, and even Stone Age Europe and China. Conflict between peer groups, outside of their own direct political influence, could well have been the norm. Within an overarching shared cultural and religious framework. Oh, what wonders these people of the Xingu may have created had there been limestone here, like there was for the Maya. And what real wonders they almost certainly did produce that have been lost as a result of their being crafted in wood. The earthworks of the Amazon were often just as time-consuming as pyramids in stone, and would have been wildly impressive in their day. The archaeology revealed here over the past decades definitively showing indigenous Amazonians were no less complex, socially, politically, or technologically than other world regions, no less remarkable in their achievements, just having a different toolkit to work with. No domesticatable animals, for example. The view differs dramatically from what respected scholars like Betty Meggers were used to. Today, the work of Michael Heckenberger and colleagues continues providing incredible insights into what life would have been like in regions of great forests all over the world. We'll only continue to find out more in the future. As we have seen, the Xingu is just one of a growing number of cases across Amazonia that refute the long-held views of primitive societies lacking features of social complexity. Once radical views, now impossible to ignore. Today, the Amazon is at the forefront of world history, challenging the long-held assumptions for cradles of civilization elsewhere in the world. It is an area that may even hold clues on how to save Earth's rainforests in the future. With vast composted areas between ancient settlements being made of terra preta, the potential to use this again in the future to restore areas where forest has been turned to ranches and then desertified is increasingly being raised. Jose Iriarte and Dennis Lombardi of the University of Exeter are among the scholars working on such sustainable landscape investigations as these. Percy Fawcett, then, had been right all along. As we have seen in the decades since his time 100 years ago, throughout the Amazon, in the Beni in Bolivia, Acre in the southwest, the Upper Xingu, the Opano in Ecuador, and many others. Archaeology has revealed a flourishing prehistoric world, likely once supporting millions upon millions of people, home to innumerable diverse systems of economic infrastructure and myriad monumental landscapes. Today, in the complete opposite view to Betty Meggers' idea, the Amazon can even be considered a cradle of civilization. An idea notably put forward by indigenous scholar Julio Teo at the beginning of the 20th century, when he surmised Amazonian origins for Andean civilization in his native Peru. In the wake of a vast population movement in from the outside world, however, and the development of numerous vast metropolises along the Great River and its many tributaries, the descendants of those builders of old make up but a tiny percentage of the population of Amazonia now. No wonder, then, that so much has been lost. the likelihood is that many more cultures will continue to be discovered and investigated across Amazonia in the decades and centuries to come. Maybe even the remains of Percy Fawcett. Today, there is a good argument, not just for one Zed, but a whole civilization of them.